The sun dipped lower, its light spilling across the sky like molten fire, staining the clouds in rich streaks of gold and crimson. The hills beyond the town seemed to swallow the day whole, their shadows stretching long and deep, creeping steadily toward the cobblestone streets. The air carried a stillness that felt unnatural, as though the town itself held its breath. Inside one of the houses, the silence broke with a sound so small yet so commanding, a single knock against the old wooden door. The echo traveled through the narrow hallway, bouncing off the cracked walls, making it feel louder than it truly was. It was not a hurried knock, not the frantic call of someone seeking safety. It was deliberate, calm, heavy with meaning. The wind outside had fallen quiet, the chirping of crickets ceased, and even the shifting branches seemed to pause. That single knock lingered in the air longer than it should have, forcing the occupants inside to exchange uneasy glances. Each person felt the same chill coil down their spine. This was not the arrival of a traveler looking for rest, nor of a neighbor paying a visit. It was something else entirely, something that none of them had been ready to face. The door creaked open slowly, as though reluctant to reveal what stood on the other side. A tall figure stepped across the threshold, his boots leaving faint traces of dust on the wooden floorboards. His presence filled the room before his voice ever did. The stranger's eyes, sharp and unyielding, swept across every face in silence. It wasn't the kind of look that searched, it was the kind that already knew. His clothes were travel-worn, faded by sun and wind, yet he carried himself with a quiet strength. No weapon was visible, no burden strapped to his back, yet the weight he bore was unmistakable. It wasn't steel or leather that marked him dangerous, but the aura of someone who had walked through storms and returned with truths too heavy to keep hidden. Each step he took made the wooden floor groan softly, as though the house itself disapproved of his arrival. The silence around him deepened with every movement, pressing against the ears of those who watched. There was no need for words, no need for threat, his very stillness was enough to command attention. The people gathered inside felt it at once, that strange sensation of being stripped bare, as though the stranger's gaze peeled away their defenses one by one. He had brought nothing in his hands, but everything in his silence. At the far end of the room, a small group sat clustered around the dim glow of a fading oil lamp. Its flame flickered unsteadily, casting long shadows that shifted across their faces. The uneven light revealed the strain etched into their expressions, tight jaws, restless hands, eyes that refused to linger too long on the stranger who had just entered. Among them sat the eldest of the group, his back slightly hunched but his presence still commanding. His gnarled hands gripped the handle of his cane, the wood polished smooth from years of use. The tremor in his fingers wasn't from weakness alone, it was stirred by something deeper, something that the stranger's arrival had awakened inside him. He stared at the man by the doorway, his eyes narrowing as if trying to peer through time itself. Recognition danced faintly across his face, not the recognition of a friend long lost, nor of a simple traveler passing through, but of a memory he had spent years trying to bury. The stranger's silence spoke louder than any greeting, and the elder felt the weight of it pressing down on him, stirring ghosts he thought were gone. The others glanced between the elder and the newcomer, uncertain. Their unease thickened in the air, every breath growing heavier as though the room itself had shrunk. No one dared speak first. No one wanted to break the fragile moment that hung between past and present, truth and concealment. Outside, the town lay in an unnatural hush. The streets that usually carried the shuffle of feet and the murmur of neighbors had emptied long before the stranger arrived. Wooden shutters were drawn tightly, doors locked, and windows sealed. Behind thin curtains, faint silhouettes lingered, watching without daring to be seen. It was as though the entire town had rehearsed this moment, each household retreating into silence the instant they sensed what was coming. Even the animals felt it. Dogs that normally barked at every passing shadow now sat quiet, ears pinned back, their eyes fixed on the stillness of the road. Horses in their stables shifted restlessly, hooves clattering against the floorboards, noses flaring at something unseen but felt. The air itself seemed to carry a tension, heavy and unwelcoming, as though the earth beneath the cobblestones recognized the weight of footsteps that had entered it. The wind, which usually danced freely through the alleys at dusk, had died without warning. No leaves rustled, no branches bent, no crickets sang. It was the silence of anticipation, the silence of something vast and inevitable drawing near. The town wasn't simply quiet, it was holding itself in place, bracing for what everyone knew but no one dared to say aloud. Inside, those gathered around the flickering lamp could feel that silence pressing against the walls, seeping through every crack, reminding them that this night was different. The world outside had stopped for a reason. And whatever that reason was, it stood now in their doorway. The stranger finally broke the silence. His voice was steady, low, and unhurried, yet it carried an undeniable weight. He did not ask for food, nor for shelter, nor for the comfort of company. Instead, he asked for something far more unsettling: answers. His words, though few, seemed to cut through the air like a blade, stripping away the fragile calm that had settled in the room. Each syllable carried a certainty that was impossible to ignore. He was not searching blindly, he already knew part of the truth, and he was here to uncover the rest. The people seated before him felt exposed, as though their thoughts had been laid bare the moment his voice reached them. His questions were not accusations, yet they struck with the same force, leaving no place to hide. The younger among them shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting anywhere but toward the stranger. A woman's hand trembled as she reached for the edge of the table, gripping it tightly, as though the wooden surface could anchor her against the storm his presence stirred. The elder did not move, but the set of his jaw grew tighter, his grip on his cane firm, as if bracing himself for the inevitable. The lamp's flame flickered again, thin and fragile, throwing brief sparks of light across their troubled faces. No one spoke in reply. The room, once silent out of uncertainty, was now silent out of fear that words, once spoken, could not be taken back. The stranger's demand for answers was more than a request. It was a command. One of the younger men shifted in his chair, his restlessness breaking the stillness that had gripped the room. His jaw tightened, and his fists clenched at his sides as though preparing to strike an enemy no one else could see. He had grown up hearing stories about men like this, wanderers who walked into towns with nothing but questions and shadows, carrying both justice and ruin wherever they went. Some called them saviors, others called them curses. His eyes flicked toward the stranger, full of unease. The man standing before them was not wild-eyed or threatening, not reckless or loud. That was what made him dangerous. There was no anger in his voice, no desperation in his posture, only a calm, unwavering certainty. It was that certainty, more than anything, that unsettled the younger man. For anger could be met with anger, and threats could be resisted. But certainty was like stone, immovable, unbreakable. The younger man's breathing quickened despite himself. He could feel the weight of truth pressing in, as though the stranger's very presence peeled away the lies that had been carefully woven through the years. His mind raced with questions he dared not speak aloud. What does he know? How much has he seen? And most frightening of all, what will he demand when the truth finally surfaces? The room felt smaller now, suffocating, as though the walls had moved closer, boxing them all in. Each second that passed without a word was a second stretched taut, ready to snap. The younger man's fists trembled slightly, not with the desire to fight, but with the unbearable pressure of waiting. The elder finally rose from his chair, the weight of years making the movement slow but deliberate. His cane tapped softly against the wooden floor, each strike echoing through the quiet room. Though his back was bent and his frame worn with age, there was still a gravity in his posture, the kind that came not from strength of body but from the authority of memory. He lifted his gaze and met the stranger's eyes. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other, the silence between them charged with something far heavier than words. Recognition flickered in the elder's face, an old truth rising from the shadows of time. He knew this man, not in name perhaps, but in the shape of his presence, in the weight of the past he carried into the room. Neither spoke of it, neither needed to. Sometimes the truth lived not in spoken words but in the air between two people, in the way a glance could cut deeper than any blade. The elder's fingers curled tighter around the handle of his cane, not out of fear but out of restraint, as though gripping the past itself to keep it from spilling forward. The others in the room looked on in silence, shifting uneasily as if they too could feel the current that passed between the old man and the stranger. It was not a reunion, nor a confrontation, it was something far more complicated, something unspoken yet undeniable. The years that separated them seemed to collapse in an instant, leaving only a raw, unfinished story hanging in the space they shared. The flame in the oil lamp wavered as if unsettled by the weight pressing down on the room. Shadows stretched long and thin across the walls, swallowing every corner until the space felt smaller, tighter, as though it were closing in on those inside. The silence, once fragile, now pressed like a hand against the chest, forcing shallow breaths from everyone present. No one dared to speak, yet the air itself seemed to demand it. Words hung unspoken on trembling lips, secrets clawing upward from the depths where they had been buried for years. The weight of them was suffocating, gnawing at the edges of composure. Even the walls, lined with cracks and fading paint, seemed to lean closer, listening, waiting for the first fracture in the silence. The elder's steady gaze remained locked on the stranger, but even he could feel the room tightening around them. The others shifted restlessly, hands clasping and unclasping, eyes darting toward the door as if escape might still be possible. But deep inside, each of them knew there was no way out. The stranger had not come to ask politely, and the night would not allow them to pretend any longer. The lamp sputtered once more, its glow shrinking before flaring back to life. That brief flicker carried with it a grim reminder: their fragile peace was dying. The truth, long kept buried, was stirring at last, and there was no stopping its rise. At last, a voice broke through the suffocating silence. It did not belong to the elder or the stranger but to someone seated in the corner, a figure who had remained quiet until now. Their voice trembled as it rose, raw and uneven, as though every word cost them more than they could bear. The confession tumbled out in fragments, rushed and desperate, as if the truth had been trapped inside for too long and now clawed its way free. The others turned toward the speaker, their faces tightening with disbelief, then dread. The words spilled faster, weaving together pieces of a story none of them wanted to hear, deeds buried beneath years of silence, lies whispered to keep the peace, sins hidden in shadows that had finally grown too heavy to contain. With every sentence, the illusion that had bound the group unraveled, thread by fragile thread. The air in the room shifted instantly. It became colder, sharper, as though the very atmosphere recoiled from the confession. The younger man clenched his fists tighter, his knuckles pale, while the elder lowered his head slightly, eyes closing as though bracing against a storm he had long known would come. The woman near the table pressed a hand to her mouth, her breath catching as her world cracked apart around her. It was no longer silence that filled the room but the weight of truth. It hung heavy, poisonous, seeping into every corner. What had once been unspoken was now exposed, and there would be no going back. The stranger did not move. He stood as still as stone, his face unreadable, his eyes fixed on the trembling figure who had just laid their soul bare. He did not interrupt, did not question, did not offer comfort. He simply listened, and in that silence there was a terrible finality. It was the silence of judgment, the kind that needed no gavel, no decree. The truth had already passed its sentence. When the confession ended, the room seemed to collapse into stillness again. No one spoke. The sound of the lamp's faint hiss, the uneven breaths of those gathered, and the occasional groan of the old wooden beams were the only noises left. But outside, the wind had risen, rattling the shutters, scraping against the roof as if the world itself had shifted in answer to what had just been revealed. The elder lifted his head at last, his eyes heavy, his shoulders burdened by memories that no longer had the safety of silence. He knew, as they all did, that nothing in this town would remain the same. Bonds had been broken, trust had been shattered, the fragile peace that had carried them this far was gone. The stranger's gaze moved slowly across the room, settling on each person in turn. No words were needed. Each of them understood that his coming had never been about threats or vengeance. It had been about truth, and truth, once spoken, could not be buried again. The night deepened outside, the wind howled, and the lamp's flame wavered once more. Inside, they sat in the wreckage of their secrets, each one knowing that dawn would not bring them comfort, only the beginning of something new and irreversible.